And good afternoon for the official start of today's March 5th Foreign Policy Association Partnership Program on Great Decisions. Today is a really exciting discussion on the Korean Peninsula we will get to very shortly. As we were just talking with our guests beforehand, this has been a long partnership between WorldOregon and the Foreign Policy Association. If you haven't had a chance yet to buy the Great Decision book, even though today is the last one of the series, still great articles in there. I encourage you to buy one. I'm posting it in the chat. There's a Kindle version as well. Our presenter will reference that. So if you had a chance to read the article, your homework will be paid off. So we'll get to that in just a minute. We're thrilled to be having one of our board members introduce her, and I'll get to that in just a sec. But first, I wanted to thank so many of you who joined us last night for our International Speaker Series event with Ari Shapiro, the Beaverton High School alum who really gave a moving and personal talk, and then a great Q&A about the role of journalism in this challenging time. I hope you had a chance to see him. It was really quite an amazing evening. If you don't have tickets yet and you're interested in joining us for the last event, which is coming up in April 7th, that is Tom Colicchio, who is the lead judge on Top Chef. And we have asked him to come speak about the challenge of food insecurity, which is really a global program that unfortunately hits our own local communities. So posted that in the chat as well. One other thing I just want to mention that we announced last night at International Speaker Series is our annual fundraiser is coming up on April 29th. It's called World Quest. For those of you who've been, it's a kick in the pants when you go in person. We have a lot of fun too virtually, and we'll have some neat storytelling and an opportunity for you to support great programs like this. So I just posted that in the chat as well. It's April 29th. Encourage you to RSVP, and it's a free event. Encourage you to donate to help support, but you can click on the link to be reminded after you register for the event. I want to mention at the end of today's program, because it is the last program of this great decision series, we'll have 3 short anonymous poll questions to help get some feedback as we craft the series, the feedback we can provide also the Foreign Policy Association, and as we adapt to this hybrid model, or what's the future of in-person and virtual. So I ask you to please stay on to answer those questions. If for some reason you can't, you will be getting an email probably with a link to those questions as well. And now to today's program. We are thrilled to be doing this. Korea is a key partner for Oregon. We were just chatting with the panelists before that, and they'll make mention of that, but it's long been a trade and investment partner. We have partnered with the Korean Honorary Consul to Oregon to help promote this in the Korean American community here. And we have done events in the past with the Korea Economic Institute and through the World Affairs Councils of America. So we're thrilled to be having their leader here today. And for the formal introduction of her, I would like to introduce our trustee, Ambassador Mary Carlin Yates, herself a former retired career ambassador. And it is an honor to have her with us. And I'm going to give her the floor to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Derek, so much. It's really a pleasure to have been asked to introduce my friend, Ambassador Kathy Stevens. I will try to be brief because you need to have all the time you can to learn from her. And if you had a chance to watch the Great Decisions video, you've already seen her in action. Currently, Ambassador Stevenson is in Washington, D.C. as president and CEO of KEI, the Korean Economic Institute, after a really stellar foreign service career. Kathy and I met in Korea in the 1980s when we were both serving there in the U.S. Embassy. I was struggling to learn Korean, and she already spoke it well because she had served there with the Peace Corps from 75 to 77. At that point, our careers went in very different directions, but we stayed in touch. And I think in part, Kathy, it was because of the love of Korea and the times we had in Korea. Anyway, Kathy served in China, the former Yugoslavia, Portugal, Northern Ireland, and she was the consul general there in Belfast during the negotiations that culminated in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Then in India, where she was charge at the embassy from 2014 to 15. And those were just the overseas assignments. She also held senior positions in Washington, D.C., working in the Clinton White House, working at state as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia. She was also the PDAS, as we call them, for European Affairs, and the Acting Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. But her time in Korea, which is worth an entire long expose itself, she was the first woman ambassador to Korea. She was a fluent Korean language speaker when she was there from 2008 to 11. And in 2010, the Foreign Service gave her the Foreign Service Linguist Award of the Year, which is quite a tribute. Anyway, after her diplomatic career, then she was welcomed at Stanford from 2015 to 18 to serve as the William Perry Fellow for Korea at Stanford. Now I'm going to bow out. It's an amazing career, and I know you're not done, Kathy. We'll see what's coming next. Over to you. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It is really a pleasure to see you, even at this distance. And good afternoon to everyone. I know it's just turned afternoon in Portland. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I wish I was with you, but I'm happy to join you this way. And thanks to Derek and Tim and everyone who's organized this and invited me. I have to add a little bit to Mary's introduction and how we met. As she said, we met in Korea, and you know, Mary mentioned that I was the first woman to serve as U.S. ambassador to Seoul. That was in 2008, but it was way back in the early 1980s that you know, Mary and I in the Foreign Service, we were the first one. Mary was the first woman to be sent to the hotspot of Gwangju to represent the United States there. And I was the first political officer in the embassy in Seoul. So this may seem like the dark ages to a lot of you, but I still remember, and I know Mary does too, that people were in shock. And when I say people, I mean all the men at the embassy. They had a lot more trouble adjusting to the notion that women were coming to these positions in many ways than the Koreans did. But that's a whole other story. And Mary and I should do a panel on that sometime. But we certainly bonded over our struggles with the Korean language and our the way that we, as so many people do, who, when you get to Korea, it kind of sticks. It becomes a lifelong passion. And as you can see, it really has been one for me, and I know for Ambassador Yates and for many, many others. I like this Great Decisions series. I'm a little bit familiar with it. And as Derek said, I did want to mention that I think the article that you've been reading, many of you, by Scott Snyder, who's a good friend of mine at the Council on Foreign Relations, is excellent. He does focus, as I'm going to focus in my talk, on the US-South Korea relationship, but we're going to talk about the Korean Peninsula because we do have to think of it as a peninsula. That's kind of maybe point one. And two, I would say, in addition to that article, the reading list I just looked at is terrific as well. So if you find this talk inadequate, I highly recommend the article and the reading list, but I will try to, first of all, do the most difficult part of this talk, and that is figure out how to share my screen and pull up my slides, which again, I'll try to go through fairly quickly because this is a big topic and I have a lot to say about it. And hang on just a sec, I want to try to, okay. Can you all see that slide if I start this? I'll get a yes from someone, let's see.
Yes, we can. This is Derek, we can see it.
Thank you, slideshow. Okay, play from start. All right. As I was starting to say, a lot to talk about within just less than an hour, and what I most look forward to the discussion. So I really will try to make some key points in a I hope, stimulating, if not provocative way, and give us something to discuss as we go forward. But, you know, I thought I'd start off with President Truman, who was a very consequential president, of course, because when I thought about the theme of great decisions, I'm reminded of something I discovered just a few years ago. And that is in reading President Truman's farewell speech in January 1953, when he left office and President Eisenhower took office. He gave a farewell speech, which I commend to all of you. And if you think about how consequential his presidency was and the decisions that he made, that he was involved in, from the decision to use atomic weapons in the war against Japan, to the Marshall Plan, to the recognition of Israel, I could go on, the shaping of our post-Cold War world. he made a lot of important decisions, consequential decisions. And yet here's what he said, and I have the quote here. He talks in detail about how he reached it in this farewell address, a fairly short farewell address. Most important of all, we acted in Korea. The decision, I believe, was the most important in my time as President of the United States. So I think you're right to pick for the great decisions, the US relationship with Korea. There have been many pivot points in the relationship, but clearly the decision that President Truman made when he got the news while he was actually at his home in Missouri, I believe, for a weekend on June 25th, June 26, 1950, that North Korean troops had crossed the 38th parallel, which was supposed to be the temporary dividing line between the Soviet-controlled North and the US-controlled South in the aftermath of World War II. He made a decision quite quickly to that the new Republic of Korea, only founded in 1948, needed to be defended. And he went to the United Nations and won the support of the other members of the United Nations. The Soviet Union happened to be boycotting, which made it a little bit easier to support. And so to this day, there are UN forces, UN command forces in Korea enforcing an armistice reached just 6 months after Truman left office. So I'm getting ahead of my story, but a consequential time. And the other sort of thought I guess I'm starting off with, because I think is important to this idea of great decisions, and I'm going to move forward to the decisions of today. I think the Scott Snyder article sets the framework very well, and in terms of the US ends while the Trump administration is still in office. So I'm going to kind of bring us quickly up to date, I think, hopefully fairly quickly, and then talk a little bit about some thoughts about, the new Biden administration, the decisions that it faces, the challenges that it faces. And again, clearly the Biden administration faces a lot of decisions and problems and issues, but Korea is a very important one. And in that context, if you think about those things, I also like something else about Truman, and that is that he is, I think everyone knows, was not a man of elite education or background, but he was intellectually curious, and he believed that reading history was key to making good decisions. And so here's a couple of quotes from him about history. I think the idea is the truth is all I want from history. We know sometimes getting the truth of history is a very elusive, but nonetheless important objective. So I think it's always good to start out, with a map. I'm not very objective about this, but I think that a map that shows the Korean Peninsula hanging, that appendage off the mainland of Asia, is a dramatic one that almost says more than I can with few words about the Korean Peninsula's geopolitical status. It has for centuries been at the vortex of great power rivalry in Northeast Asia. Rivalry between China and Japan and Russia, and rivalries involving the United States as well. In the aftermath of the Japanese defeat and the US occupation of Japan in 1945, of course, US attention was very focused on the future of Japan. And the phrase, which had been used in previous times too, was often used, and you find this in old US government papers, that when they looked at the Korean Peninsula, yes, they knew that they needed to pay attention to Korea. China was still in revolution, of course. Mao did not take power. The Chinese Communist Party did not take power until 1949. But in those years, they looked at that peninsula and they said, it's a dagger pointing at the heart of Japan. So in many ways, Korea was looked upon in the context of Japan's future, Japan's security, and how to handle Japan in the aftermath of this terrible war. But of course, over the years, many other rivalries have come to shape Korea. But in terms of Korea itself, Korea has not only now, and we'll talk about now, but historically been in that position. Sometimes I compare a little bit. Comparisons are always inadequate, but maybe Poland in Europe, where it's had to be, successive leaders have had to be very skillful. They haven't always been, but have had to really try to maneuver amidst these great powers, and have often paid the cost in the most tragic and human of ways, in terrible destruction and wars of great power competition, keenly felt by the Korean people and in Korean history. So just, I'm not going to read all these things to you. I'm just putting them up here as a reminder to me and something you may want to think about or ask about later. But even just over the last century, won't go further than that, Korea was continually forced toward the center of international affairs. As Asia, China, Japan, all of Asia had to address and deal with the challenges coming from Western imperialism, the demands to open to trade and commerce and missionaries coming from Europe and also from the US and elsewhere. 2 wars were fought really over Korea, but among, again, the great powers, if you like. One, the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895, which the Japanese shocked the world and certainly shocked the imperial court in China by winning, and shocked the Korean court, which looked to China for protection. And then followed, of course, by the even more to the world shocking victory of the Japanese over the Russians. Again, essentially with Korea being part of the perceived spoils. And with the Japanese victory came annexation of Korea by Japan, full annexation in 1910, and Korea remaining a colony. And again, we're talking about Korea, not divided Korea, but the Korean Peninsula, the whole Korea, all of Korea, until 1945 with the surrender. And with the surrender, the division of Korea, intended in the aftermath of 1945 to again be a temporary division to take the surrender from the Japanese, hardened into a hard division with the chilling of the Cold War, and then from a Cold War to a hot war, the first hot war of the Cold War, I guess you could say, with the US and China eventually engaged in a very terrible and fierce conflict alongside their respective Korean allies in the North and in the South. And a war, of course, ending not in a permanent peace settlement, but in an armistice, which is in place imperfectly, but importantly to this day. So jumping way forward, of course, we had then these 2, if you like, rival Korean states pursuing their different paths, kind of a microcosm or a concentration of all the tensions of the Cold War and the competing ideologies and systems. But even after, if you like, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, North Korea, known as the DPRK, right, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, refused to just sort of give up and instead became a hereditary communist, or at least ostensibly communist state, very authoritarian, totalitarian. And increasingly, as it saw South Korea surging ahead in international legitimacy and economic and political development, the DPRK turned to, if you like, an asymmetric approach and developed nuclear weapons and now even intercontinental missiles, but a very robust missile system in response to what it sees as a continuing American threat. And of course, South Korea in the meantime has enjoyed great success. But now I would say it's fair to say it faces an uncertain strategic environment, I mean, don't we all, generated by China's rise and by some questions which I'm going to talk more about regarding the durability of its longstanding security alliance with us. So when I think about the Korean Peninsula in terms of US foreign policy, I love to talk about the South Korean journey as well. It's an incredible story and one in which the US can take, I think, much satisfaction. But talking about from the point of foreign policy, I would say there's been success and failure. And again, this is not to say that the Koreans, North and South, don't have considerable agency, but kind of looking at it as a former Foreign Service officer, here's how I would look at it. There have been recurrent tensions. These are not, some of them really flared up during the Trump administration, but many of them were not new. US actions, including in domestic politics or actions elsewhere that led to South Korean doubts about whether or not the US was really committed to South Korea's security. Of course, South Korea and the US formed a defense alliance in 1953 in the aftermath of the armistice. But you know, there have been times when South Korea has wondered, would the US really come through, faced with a continuing threat from the North? And the US, of course, because it has played such a big role, and of course, again, Ambassador Yates knows well about this, but over time, the US has been thought that it should have done by many South Koreans more than it did or differently than it did to live up to its own values and ideals. Particularly the notion that South Korea's legitimacy in our eyes and South Koreans' eyes was derived from the fact they weren't North Korea, and they weren't North Korea because they weren't authoritarian. They were an aspiring democracy. But democracy did not come easily. It did come in the 1980s, and they've never looked back. And that's why we were so fortunate to be there at that time to witness this. But there's a sense that the US perhaps is not always, if you like, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. This won't surprise anybody, I don't think. Trade and economic frictions over the years, the kind of tensions that do come with a large US force presence anywhere in the world, whether in the US or elsewhere. But USFK refers to US Forces Korea. We have about 27,000 troops there, along with families and many contractors. It's a smaller presence than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but of course quite substantial. Many of them are now based on in a consolidated military installation built at the cost of $12 billion US dollars from the Korean taxpayer to build what is the largest US Army base outside the continental United States. That's all. I mean, a good thing in terms of the alliance and the sense of security. But of course, when you have a presence, again, there are many controversies about it, and these have always had to be managed. But even I would say more fundamentally, the US, Washington and Seoul have tried to work together on North Korea policy, and we certainly have shared goals, but different perspectives and different priorities, I would say, and some of that depends on who's in power, whether in Washington or in Seoul. But most importantly of all, I would say clearly the US ROK alliance has been a success. But I would have to say that US foreign policy towards North Korea, just judging by our goals, I'm sorry, I messed up, has been a failure. We have now seen repeated efforts, very dramatic ones during the Trump, very unprecedented and unconventional ones during the Trump administration, but many, many efforts over the last several decades to try to achieve certain goals vis-a-vis North Korea, including no nuclear weapons, a move to a sustainable peace, something to replace the armistice, reconciliation, reunification, human rights. And I would have to say that the record on this, I think everyone would agree, has been, despite many efforts in many ways, we have failed in that. But going back to the US-South Korean alliance, over this time it has broadened and deepened. I'm only going to mention a couple things on the list here. One, of course, is the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, which was ratified after going through several iterations and several administrations in both Seoul and Washington. Free trade agreements weren't easy then. They're certainly not easy now. But ratified in 2012 and has been, I think, a success. And I'd be interested in particular with Portland, with its trade and so on. I think we've seen not only a real uptick in trade in both directions, but also in Korean investment here in the United States, and a removal of a lot of the so-called kind of non-trade barriers, the regulatory and other things that for a long time really did slow down trade. It was updated in 2017. Of course, the Trump administration described it as a renegotiation. I think it would be fair to say it was an update and is in pretty good shape right now, although there is the question of what comes next, and we will get to that. But the things I really want to emphasize about how the US and South Korea relationship has changed since the days that I was a Peace Corps volunteer, or Ambassador Yates and I were there as young Foreign Service officers, is such a deepening. And I know this always sounds a little soft, but it's actually so important, of people-to-people ties. The South Korean soft power. Now, let me just say that, and we can talk more about it, but I think you know what I mean. Of course, with the pandemic, things have slowed down a bit, but the fact that South Korea over the years has consistently sent more students per capita, per its population, than any other country in the world is a vote by the South Korean people in the importance of the ties with the United States, as is the fact, of course, that the Korean American community has grown in the United States in not only size, but influence, and a real interest in, and again, shoring up the relationship. It pleases me a great deal that the sitting US Congress now has 4 Korean American members of Congress. That's up from 1 previously. And indeed, of those 4, 3 are women. I think 2 are Republicans, 2 are Democrats, 2 are from the East Coast, 2 are from the West Coast. I think I have that right. It says a lot, I think, about the breadth and depth also of the Korean American community in this country. And most of all, I would emphasize that Korea's global weight and status as a middle power plus has grown and grown. I mean, whether we talk about Bang Ki-moon, the former South Korean foreign minister who served 2 terms as the UN Secretary General. Its membership in international organizations, not just as a member, but as a leader. South Korea is going to be joining the G7 as an additional participant for the first time in June in the UK, when that will probably be the first, I think, in-person summit meeting since Biden administration and really since the pandemic. And then most of all, I would talk about, particularly in recent times, there's been great and I think very much deserved admiration for South Korea's response to COVID-19. South Korea and the US both had their first diagnosed or confirmed case of COVID-19 way back, that's what, January 2020. And I just have to say, rather sadly for us, the trend lines went in opposite direction since then. And through that, they have also demonstrated great resilience in their democratic, their political, and their bureaucratic, if I could say, institutions, and an ability to really manage this in a way that has won them much praise and much standing. So here's just a couple of general thoughts about the alliance as it is now. And I guess I would also say this is kind of what I think the Biden administration is probably thinking about the alliance. At least I hope they are. I would kind of be saying these things to them if they would ask me for my advice. And again, I hasten to add, I'm just talking about my own personal opinions here. But I do think that even with all the, and perhaps especially because of the geopolitical flux, if I can use that term, that Northeast Asia is in, given in particular the rise of China, changing perceptions and perhaps roles of the United States, that even because of that, the US-South Korea alliance remains a critical component of our strategy and policy in Asia. I think that's pretty well understood. I've seen press reporting just today, actually, so I'm not saying anything that has been told to me in confidence, that our new Secretary of State and new Secretary of Defense may be traveling to Northeast Asia, to Seoul and Tokyo, perhaps elsewhere, as soon as later this month. If that's true, and it wouldn't surprise me if it is, I think it indicates that there's a clear understanding of this point. And also a clear understanding that indeed this alliance faces some new headwinds because of all of these shifts. President Biden, as a candidate and now as president, has talked almost every time he's asked about foreign policy, or maybe every time, about restoring, revitalizing. He uses a number of words, U.S. alliances in general. I would certainly, it won't surprise you, think that the South Korean alliance is especially critical in this context because of its geopolitical centrality. And that this is going to be the right step to take. Now, the question, of course, is how exactly do you go about doing that? Just to back up, to say a couple of things about the past 4 years with the Trump administration and relations with Korea. Again, I think this is pretty familiar to everyone, but I think, Mr. Trump came to office with some actually very strong views about alliances, and in particular about South Korea. And he made those pretty clear. Sometimes they were somewhat at variance with what, if you like, the institutions even under him were saying of the more institutionalized relationship, but great suspicion of allies as freeloaders, free riders, whether it's in trade or in sharing the burden of a security presence and commitment. And this did lead to a lot of uncertainty in the relationship, and was exacerbated also by the fact that there was a certain lack of consultation that you had, and we all got used to or not used to the sort of the tweets and so on. But as Mary and all of you who've dealt with Korea or Asia know, I mean, people pay a lot of attention in Korea to what's said here. And when there were words from the president about not seeing the reason to have military exercises, or for that matter, a military presence in South Korea, seeing the trade relationship as inherently unequal and wrong. This created a lot of tension and a lot of uncertainty within the relationship and within South Korea. Also very challenging for South Korea, of course, was to see the deterioration of US-China relationships. Again, the ROK, South Korea, is in this place where it's trying to balance these economic ties and this border, this shared space with China. and its need for China, its view that it needs China if there's going to be any sort of lasting resolution or progress even towards resolution vis-a-vis North Korea, balancing all that with its security alliance towards the US. And again, being in a position where it was sometimes felt that it was being asked to make choices, even zero-sum choices that it didn't want to make. I think Scott Snyder writes well about that. And North Korea, of course, respect with North Korea, that was a more complicated story, if you like, I think, from the South Korean perspective, and in particular from the perspective of the current Moon Jae-in's government, who very much is eager to see, any South Korean government is, but to actually take what we used to call in Northern Ireland risks for peace, to step out there and see what's possible. But, and in the Trump administration, of course, we went from 2017 when, by every measure, including the president's own words, the memoirs of his Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, and the impression on the ground in South Korea was closer to hosting a war at a time and a place not of its choosing, but the place being the Korean Peninsula, than it had been since the 1950s. This was obviously a very existential issue. But the pivot from that to the year of summit diplomacy, to the special relationship between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, the first president to meet not once, but 3 times with the North Korean leader. This was all, in a way, very welcome to South Korea. And certainly there was an effort to try to harness this towards the goals, not only of denuclearization, but of really jumpstarting and sustaining rapprochement and reconciliation and lowered tensions with North Korea. In a word, I think we have to say that this failed. We could talk more about this and where it leaves us, but we are left today with that approach, if you like, of the summit diplomacy having been tried. It doesn't mean maybe it doesn't work, but we have to think about why that didn't work. But importantly, North Korea, having continued to not only assert and insist on its right and its intent to continue to deepen and develop its nuclear weapons arsenal and its delivery capabilities with respect to ballistic missile systems, but also spurning at this point further dialogue. So this is one of the challenges, not only for the Biden administration, for the Moon administration. And of course, within this context, and again, we can talk more about this, North Korea has self-isolated more than any sanctions ever did, and remains deeply, deeply concerned about the pandemic, has taken extreme measures to try to ensure that it does not succumb to the pandemic, claims not to have had any confirmed cases. Cannot verify that, hard to really believe, but certainly they've taken every measure in terms of really closing the place down. Some of you may have seen a photograph, it was in some of the newspapers of just a week or so ago. There are very few foreigners, well, there are never many foreigners in North Korea, but very few diplomatic missions and foreigners in North Korea, and some Russian diplomats with their families evacuated to the Russian border. North Korea shares a short border with Russia. And the final part of the journey, it was a fairly long journey by some rather antiquated but working trains, was via a hand-powered rail trolley. Quite a photograph of a diplomatic evacuation. I've done evacuations, but never that way. So what has the Biden administration said it's going to do? Well, as I said, it's going to, the commitment is to alliances, multilateralism. That word is back in fashion. Koreans like to hear that as a classic middle power. They see multilateral institutions as a place where they can have more agency. Values is back. President Biden has talked about having a summit of democracies. This is at a time, of course, when I think a lot of people feel like democracies are under some pressure in this country as well as elsewhere. But really a turn to that, which again, I think has some considerable appeal for the South Koreans, as well as some questions that they have in terms of how that plays on the priority list vis-a-vis North Korea when it comes to issues like human rights. Climate change, a whole variety of kind of digital technology, rules of the road are all areas where South Korea has a great deal of capability, and I think will welcome a chance to work with the United States. Although, again, we have to work out, I think, how we address issues where there are, which may affect and bring pressure from China and some economic implications. The Biden administration has declared it's doing a policy review on North Korea. This is very standard, if you like, for new administrations, since as I said, every administration has declared the previous policy failed, essentially. I mean, there's been a few cases where we've tried to continue, but failed. I'm not saying the failures have always been, and I don't believe they have been, the fault of the US. There's many, many reasons for failure, but we have to look at where we've been. And right now there's a commitment to working more closely with allies, although that means not only South Korea, but other allies in the region, which takes me to my next slide, which is when we think about how this might look, it's complicated. And again, I think I'd better not go over all this, but I see some things that are going to be fairly easy to resolve fairly quickly. The first, in terms of rebuilding trust, I mean, if there is this very high level visit by 2 cabinet officials, and this becomes what's called a 2+2, the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and is regarded as a particularly significant kind of meeting to have, especially early in administration. I think that there are ways in which we can quickly resolve the negotiation, which is left over from the Trump years, on how much South Korea pays for some of the costs of US forces on the peninsula. Again, this became, quite frankly, I'm going to say, rather silly. I mean, Biden actually used the word extortionist, but it just kind of detached from the reality of the relationship. But the fact is that every American administration has looked to allies, and certainly to South Korea over the years, to step up, take more of the burden as their economic strength has increased. And certainly South Korea has done that and will do it again in this negotiation, but this time we will get to yes. And there has to be careful handling of some of the other issues having to do with South Korea's growing capabilities as a military power. They're already pretty substantial, and its desire to take on greater responsibility in the form of OPCON, meaning operational control of our combined troops at time of war as well as at time of peace. Again, this is complicated for all the kinds of reasons that any of you have been in the military know it's complicated. It's also obviously in this environment with the growing threat rather than the shrinking threat from North Korea, greater concerns about Japan. But I think this will be handled in a way of kind of mutual cooperation rather than confrontation. When it comes to multilateralism, I've mentioned why I think that's a kind of a good thing for the US-South Korea collaboration, but it also brings some challenges. Seoul and Tokyo, and some of you I'm sure are very aware of it, have difficult ties for historical reasons, and they become more difficult. In fact, probably their worst in many decades since over the last few years. Washington is going to push hard to see those improve. I don't think it's going to be easy. I would say let's watch what happens in the June Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, if they're held. I think they probably will be held, although probably in rather unusual circumstances, obviously. South Korea would like to see this as a moment, maybe for some rapprochement with Tokyo, and even for a moment, remember the Pyeongchang Olympics, for getting the North Koreans back in the game. I'm not sure that Tokyo is there yet. I don't really know, but I think there'll be some efforts. But there's also this question, I think, for the United States as it begins to kind of, not begins, this has been a longstanding theme, but we now have a senior official in the administration, Kurt Campbell, who was the Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs, who is the senior coordinator for the Indo-Pacific, this notion that the US needs to continue, and this happened during the Trump administration as well, but try to continue to deepen its ties in a more regional way, in part because of China's greater aggressiveness in the region. But how you really do that, and to what extent that is encircling China, containing China, countries like Korea, not only Korea, but others are very sensitive to that. And what it really involves will be one of the big diplomatic challenges for this administration. I've listed some of the areas where I think there can be lots of cooperation. Public health is certainly one, energy. South Koreans are opening up semiconductor plants and lithium battery plants and everything else all over the United States and elsewhere, but are certainly doubling down on some of these transformational technologies. And I think we are natural partners in many of these. With respect to policy towards North Korea, I hope and expect that that there will be an early message to North Korea to say, please don't do anything. I hope they'll be please, like testing a missile or nuclear system before we can kind of get off the ground here. We've got to get something started. But in the meantime, there also have to be steps to make sure that deterrence and defense remain strong. I'm going to lead trade policy for our discussion. Right now, I think that CPTPP, of course, is the multilateral trade agreement that was called the TPP under the Obama administration. By the time that Trump came to office, the mood in this country, even beyond, I think Trump himself had really changed and remains changed. And I think it's going to be difficult for the United States, at least immediately, for the Biden administration to get involved in multilateral trade. But then what are they going to do? And what is Korea going to do, I think are major questions going forward. I'm almost done here. So what about South Korea? They have politics too. That's one thing about being a democracy. Sometimes Washington forgets that. President Moon Jae-in is in his final year. It's a 5-year, one-term presidency, and the political season is already beginning. In fact, next month, we're going to have mayoral elections in South Korea's 2 largest cities, Seoul and Busan, and we're already seeing potential candidates start to maneuver. I mentioned the Tokyo Olympics as an opportunity. Certainly President Moon, he's got a lot to do, obviously. Their vaccinations have just begun. South Korea has done very well in keeping the pandemic under control. It's poised, I think, for a kind of an early economic recovery, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of problems. And some of the problems that consume our politics here at home too, including inequality, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So this is my final one. That's a cartoon of Moon Jae-in, the president. This is from some time ago, but I think probably that's still a little bit what it may feel like for South Korea, that these 2 big boulders called the China-US relationship and competition, sometimes from the Korean perspective, seems headed directly for trying to dislodge Korea from its own carefully laid plans, while it still struggles to deal with the other crises that it still has. So with that, I'm going to turn off my slides. I hope I didn't take up too much time there, and I really do welcome our discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs at WorldOregon. Want to, of course, thank everyone for joining us today and jump right in with questions which are starting to pop up. So let's start with how has extensive South Korean investment in China been impacted by US-China trade tensions, and can South Korea play a role in reducing these tensions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say, I think what you would hear if you asked that question in South Korea from a South Korean would say, you know, Korean investment and business in China, which has been enormous, it's been, you know, it's extremely important to South Korea, was very much affected by South Korea's decision several years ago to agree to the stationing of a ballistic missile defense in South Korea to respond to the growing North Korean missile threat. China saw this as something directed at it, but it chose to take issue with South Korea, the smaller partner, not with the US, and really imposed what can only be called economic sanctions. So, I mean, the Chinese, and they've done this elsewhere, they're doing it actually with Australia right now. The Chinese really drove, for example, a very major Korean company, Lotte, as some of you may know, which was growing its presence in China a great deal, kind of out of business in many ways in China during this period, and stopped K-pop performers from going to China, and really made it very, very difficult. So there's that, and that memory, and it actually continues in some ways, is really seared in South Korea right now in terms of if this happens again. First of all, I mean, will the US or other countries have their backs as they say, look at Australia and elsewhere, but also, yeah, what do they do about it? The trade tensions themselves, yes. I mean, certainly South Korea, you know, South Korea shares a lot of the same concerns that the US has with Chinese intellectual property violations, with many of its business practices. And I think that actually, to answer this question maybe a slightly different way, I think that we kind of lost an opportunity in the last few years because it became all about the US and China. And I think what the Biden administration, its challenge will be, can we find common ground? And my answer is, I think we can if we're ready to hear the other perspective as well, with other countries that are also concerned about China's behavior and also trying to find some ways to ameliorate it, but to shape it, to bring it, to take some effective steps. But yes, the other thing that South Korea has done is certainly I don't think they have China's too important, it's too close by, the supply chains are there, but they certainly are trying to diversify their supply chains, diversify their investments. I mentioned much increased investment in the United States, but also Vietnam, I would point out, is one place where there has been much increased South Korean investment as a means to try to, again, I would say diversify rather than decouple. Korea did join the RCEP, right, which is the what we consider the rather general kind of low grade trade, but nonetheless important multilateral trade agreement that a number of Asian countries reached, and will be interested in also trying to see if the World Trade Organization, the WTO, can be revitalized and can begin to play a more significant role. So that's where the multilateralism comes in as well.
So a few years ago, we've hosted through our international visitor program, a program with Iraqi youth, and one of my participants in that program was really keen on trying Korean food, and I kept asking this young woman, well, why do you want to try Korean food? And it turned out that she, back in Baghdad, would watch Korean soap operas, and you mentioned K-pop there for a second. Can you talk more about Korean soft power and why it is so influential?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I knew what the secret sauce was exactly. I mean, I have my ideas because I'm such a Koreaphile, but I never would have dreamed that, I mean, Korean's a language that's only spoken by Koreans. It's really hard. And, the culture is very different, but it has such tremendous appeal. Yeah, I mean, I ask people, I mean, this BTS, I ask a lot of people, young people, what do you like? And basically they just think it's really high quality. And I guess, again, those of us who were in Korea back in the day, and this is before it was democratic, before there was this big explosion of all this creativity and the kind of economic strength to do it, it just, I mean, Koreans, do impress, make things better. They take influences, they have this extraordinary sort of appreciation of art and culture, whether it's high art or popular art, and they perfect it. If they're going to be break dancers, they become the best break dancers in the world. If they're going to do these kind of fusion music things, they just take it and they make it better. That's not a very good explanation, but I don't know. I mean, to me, it's very heartwarming because it's like, oh, I knew Korea before it was cool. Now we know, and I knew it was cool. Now everyone thinks it's a cool place. I certainly didn't think a long time ago. But the other thing you mentioned Iraq. I should mention, South Korea does have a very active overseas development program, as does Japan. South Korea is the only country that once hosted Peace Corps volunteers, like myself, that now is very proud to have what they call their own Peace Corps program. And a lot of people go overseas. In Iraq, South Korea contributed the third largest number of troops after the US and the UK. And they did this despite the fact that the Iraq War was very unpopular in South Korea. They did it because they thought it was important for them as an ally to show that when something was important to the US, that they would be there to do it. But what they did while they were in Erbil, and I do know this, and it must have gone to Baghdad as well, I mean, it's now all on the airwaves, is they introduced taekwondo classes, and they introduced music classes, and they kind of shared their own culture, and so, but it's I keep talking about a middle power, but I mean, South Korea is just it just continually astonishes me, the reach of it to every single part of the world, and within the United States, to every community. It's incredible. Sorry, that's not much of an explanation. Someone needs to do a thesis on it.
So has there been a rightist anti-democratic movement in South Korea, as we've seen in the US, Europe, and elsewhere, especially given the fact that democracy is still relatively young in South Korea?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say no. I think actually what you do hear on the right now in Korea is concerns and considerable vociferous debate, which you see in the press there, about whether or not the current government is undermining democracy itself. So, you know, the debate is about what the democracy should be like. And that's been there for a long time. I mean, since, you know, they say democracy, you say, hasn't been there that long. And if you count it from, some people count it from different times, but I count it from, as most people do, from 1987, when the new constitution was introduced, when the direct election of the president was held. The person who was elected, because the opposition split, was actually from the former kind of ruling authoritarian party, but he held office, you know, and then there's been a successive transition with power moving across the political spectrum from left to right over the years. So I would say it's mixed in Korea right now. You know, on the one hand, the Koreans had their National Assembly election, right? Their congressional elections, not their presidential election, last April in the mid, and it was the first kind of major election in a democratic country since after the pandemic took hold. And they had the highest turnout like ever, and they pulled it off without any kind of problem. And I think it gave Koreans a lot of pride in the resilience of their democracy. There certainly weren't objections to its legitimacy. But you know, I think South Korea, like all democracies, is feeling the strain of polarization. You would hear the word polarization used a lot in South Korea, and worry about the impact of inequality, of the kind of turn against globalization, although again, in Korea, it's such a trade dependent country, it's not going to turn against globalization. So I guess I'd say not so much. There are these probably, in the classic way, kind of anti-liberal trends, if you like, and a reassessment. And, but again, I say as an outsider, I'd probably, you know, I'm more optimistic about the common ground there is in Korea in many ways than I am in my own country right now. Koreans, and especially those on the right, I think right now, who are out of power, do pose a lot of serious, I think, concerns about checks and balances, and about what is still a very highly centralized executive.
So, can you comment a little bit on Korea-Japan relations and how that might affect or impact U.S. regional alliances?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I said it would be hard to, I think, to exaggerate how seriously the Biden administration takes that. And this is a little bit different from the Trump administration, which I think was more detached from that. And again, coming kind of, you know, from the president himself, he saw this as very much a, you know, always a bilateral thing. The Biden administration is really going to put an emphasis on trying to improve these relationships. But, you know, both these countries, Japan and Korea, Japan has a new prime minister. I mean, you know, maybe that gives some kind of opening. But public opinion, I think, in both countries is also kind of hardened for a variety of reasons. I mean, I'm trying to, you know, not to get into the weeds of if you like the details, because I'm not sure that's exactly what matters. I'm trying to think about, you know, is it sort of this kind of rising nationalism everywhere, or this sense without the U.S. being so involved that they've drifted further apart? The Japanese doubt whether I think the Koreans are really going to be stalwart in terms of kind of standing up to China. So it's a difficult thing, I think, for us from the outside to even, you know, think about how to make better, because when you look at the outside, I mean, notwithstanding a very painful history. And, we're just rediscovering in the United States that your history is kind of always being rediscovered and could come back with incredible potency. But that notwithstanding, Japan and Korea have so much in common. Their economies are so linked. They have, on a kind of a cultural level, I mean, so much to kind of that they like about each other. I know this from the years earlier. I mean, the irony is I'm old enough to now remember, I lived in Korea just a couple of decades after the end of the, several decades after the end of the Japanese occupation. And I knew people who, had gone to Japanese, schools in Korea. And they certainly were Korean nationalists who hated the Japanese period, but they spoke Japanese. They felt an affinity in many ways for this neighbor, notwithstanding the politics and the tragedy of the past. That's kind of gone now. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of like, this is one of those areas where I think we just don't know. And I think there's a variety of things. Some of it is maybe the way that nationalist textbooks kind of indoctrinate younger people on all sides, but it has become very difficult. I do think it's important the US try to play a role, but I don't, but I think it's actually easier, if you like, in a broader regional context. I mean, we do see Japan and Korea clearly playing important roles as major economies, as major overseas development providers, as investors in a whole variety of countries. So I think there are ways in the region and in the world, I think there are ways in which they can have complementary efforts. But when it comes to, some of the hard things we need to do vis-a-vis defense decisions, vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis China, it's going to continue to be difficult, I think.
Well, as a follow-up, will Japan's conservative politicians' failure to atone for the World War II comfort women block better bilateral relations with South Korea? Well,
that is certainly the Korean perspective. The Japanese perspective is that they've atoned for it, and and to quote what I hear from many Japanese, that the Koreans keep moving the goalposts. It'll never be enough, so we should stop trying. So, but it is not resolved. And as we've seen, I mean, even in recent weeks, it comes back in different forms repeatedly. Again, maybe our experience here over the last year or so has reminded me that I worked in places like the Balkans and Northern Ireland that, in Northern Ireland, or actually it was in the Balkans, someone said, they produce more history than they can consume. And I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious about this, but my own view, so I'm talking about my personal view, is it's not enough to say, let's just put this behind us. There does have to be, but it takes political will. There have to political will to say, we need to continue to deal with this. We just can't say, which I think has been the Japanese position. It was all settled under the normalization. It was all settled by, San Francisco and the treaty. We're done with it. We've seen that's not it, but at the same time, you can't let that stop you from trying to work on the issues that you share in common that reflect your values and your interests now. So there's got to be both, in my view.
Well, we hear a lot about the phrase cancel culture, certainly over the last, year or two. And, we've been talking a little bit about pop culture. So the TV show MASH, should MASH reruns be canceled as patronizing and stereotyping to Koreans?
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, honestly, I've never heard a Korean suggest that. And I confess, I kind of like MASH. I mean, but I don't think it was very Korean, I think. So I guess my answer is I'm not bothered by it, but
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you one more question. We're coming up to the end of the program, but I think that on a lot of people's minds will talk of a US troop drawdown from South Korea subside now that the administrations have changed in the US?
I think so. I think probably so. And again, it's not that there's a magic number, but I think it's about messaging. It's about reassurance. So I think when there's, a sense that the South Koreans feel assured of the U.S. commitment, then the issue of what exactly the troop deployment is on the peninsula is less relevant. It's a bit of a kind of a It's a symbol in many ways. I mean, it's obviously important to be there, but it's also, I mean, getting back to Japan, even more important that you know, that we have this defense relationship with Japan, with far more troops in Japan who would be part of any conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
Great. I want to thank everyone for submitting their questions. Ambassador, thanks for giving us a fantastic perspective and really wonderful answers to a range of questions. I'm going to bring Derek back in, who will guide us out into the day. And I want to thank you all. This is our last Great Decisions. As you know, I've been doing this this is my 11th year of doing it, and I miss seeing you all in person. And hopefully by next year, we can see each other's faces when we gather around to talk about all these great decisions in our lives.
Thanks so much, Tim. Thanks, Ambassador Stevens and Ambassador Yates, for the introduction to her earlier. I would encourage all you loyal Great Decisions fans to stick around, because we're going to be posting the very quick, anonymous 3-question poll in just 1 minute, and ask that you give us some feedback to help us make this as best possible and help adapt other future webinars that we do. Excuse me. Also, just want to highlight, we have a great program coming up on Tuesday. I'm going to post it here in the chat. It's Julia Cook speaking on her book, Come Fly the World, the Jet Age Storage of Pan Am Stewardesses, highlighting the roles of them during the Vietnam War and the incredible bravery and roles that they took. I'm going to post this in the chat. It's coming up Tuesday, and I think it'd be you know, really one of great interest to the audience. Also have, we've just posted online as well, we have a program with Cass Sunstein, speaking on his new book, Liars, Falsehoods, and Free Speech, An Age of Deception. If you don't know him, you may know his spouse, Samantha Power, who spoke for us last year in the International Speaker Series. He is speaking on April 15th. We have lots of other good programs coming up in April, and stay tuned for those. But I particularly just wanted to highlight these ones and the one on Pan Am coming up next week. Again, please stick around for a poll, which is about to pop up. And Ambassador Stevens, thank you again for your fantastic presentation. We greatly appreciate your time. Just give you a final word just to say thanks. And maybe, is there something upcoming from the Korea Economic Institute that our audience should keep an eye on, or what's coming next? What are you working on?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I wasn't prepared for that, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I would just ask everyone, I guess, to have a look at our website. You'll see some things there, also the Korea Society. And if you want to sign up, we have a weekly newsletter called the Korea View, where we do actually try to explore some of these questions, you know, large and small, and like soft power and things like that too. So it's keia.org. But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thanks, Ambassador. I'm going to post that website in the chat. Encourage you to go there to learn more. And Tim, I'm going to pass it back to you so you can get the poll started.